So today we embark on a new journey, and this new journey has to start with this picture of the Salesforce Transbay Transit Center in San Francisco, which opened about a year ago. And about a year ago, last month, this thing opened up with great fanfare. It was a $2.2 billion project. And it's meant to be a masterpiece, a model for other large cities all across our nation to think through what urban transit could look like. And it's a sight to behold. Lynn and I, back in July, our kids were in town and we went to a Giants game and we stayed in a hotel that overlooked this, just a few blocks away. And what you're seeing there, that green space, is a park about 4 stories up. And it's open to the public. They have some food places up there and places to walk around. Sometimes they have concerts and stuff up there. And below that green space, you have a parking garage. And below that parking garage is a bus platform where you can go pick up buses. And below that is a future space for train to come into the city from wherever. It's quite something. Somewhere around 6 weeks after the transit center opened, it immediately closed because a maintenance worker was walking around and looked up at one of the steel girders that was supporting the entire span of the parking deck, which was also hanging, had hangers holding down to hold up the bus depot. So it's holding a lot of weight. And he noticed a massive crack right through this massive steel girder. I mean, these steel girders are like 8 feet tall and they're 2 feet wide. These are huge pieces of steel, and there was a crack right down one of them. So they shut it all down, kicked everybody out so they could figure out what was going on. What they discovered, I'll tell you in just a few moments. And it had to do with something I'm going to make you do today. It had to do with some assumptions made, a way of seeing the world in a particular way, which was not held in check. Some very normal, natural human tendencies to just assume that they could do whatever they thought they could do in a particular order, and it would have no effect on their life or anybody else's life. But it was that way of thinking, not allowing your paradigm to be checked, that led to this mistake, which could have led to catastrophic collapse of this $2.2 billion project. More on that in a second. It's hard for us. It's hard for us to understand and really own new truth. We don't like to do it. We don't want to do it. We don't like our paradigms to change. We're happy just the way things are. In fact, your paradigms that you've been acquiring all of your life, your mental construct has got you right till today. And I want to tell you, you look fantastic. So they're working pretty good for you, all right? And you have different degrees of happiness and success in your life, largely based on the way you're living out your world, which is entirely based on your construct, the way you're making sense of the world. The problem is that sometimes we don't realize we got a problem in our construct, in our schema, until it is too late. Until there's a crack in the beam, or until there's a crack in our lives, until things start to fall apart. And frankly, most of the time, we don't pay attention to it at all until it all falls apart. And it's when things have fallen apart that we're finally humble enough to wonder if the way we were seeing reality is the way we should continue seeing reality. This transformative process only comes in our lives a couple of times. And it only comes a couple of times because it's so hard for us to experience. Usually the way it works, if there's something truly transformative that's going to happen in our lives, like say something significant like if we go back in history and the first idea about is the world flat or is it round? If you were one of the first people to say, I've got an insight, the world is round. Let me tell you all about it. Most of the people who heard that news thought the people were absolutely crazy, maybe even demon-possessed. And some of them were looked at as heretics because the way they read the Bible at that time, the earth was clearly flat. In fact, in antiquity, we know that that's exactly how they thought about the world back then. And they had a very different cosmology back then. So if you come and you challenge that, you're challenging lots of things that people have built up over time. And if those things are not true, they can limit you in certain ways. For most of us, a flat world isn't going to mean a whole lot unless we travel a very long way. But for you, carrying out your lives, no big deal. But can you imagine the struggle to really believe that the world might in fact be round? Well, there's an exercise I'm going to have you do today, which is going to help you, I think, in the long run, avoid a catastrophe in your life. At least in your life of faith, maybe in your life period. We don't often recognize it, but there's a world is flat issue that a lot of us struggle with in our faith and the way we think about God and the way we think about going into the world. And it has a lot to do with what we've held as true, what's been handed down to us over the generations about the way God works, who God is, and all that. There's a statement that I've made before, and I'm going to share it with you now and explain why it matters. The statement is this: until you know what you believe, you will not believe any differently. Until you know what you believe, you will not believe any differently. Or another way to put it, until you know what you know, you'll never know any different. Until you know what you know, you're never going to know any different. And there's a real good reason why. We protect ourselves from new information. You know how your brain works? This is how your brain works. This was part of my doctoral studies back in the day. Did my theological stuff on theology, on soteriology specifically, and then the practical part of my Doctor of Ministry was on adult transformational learning theory. And in that, I had to learn about how the adult brain learns. And through this process, this is what I discovered. That a lot of times, brand new information, new paradigms, new ways of living really never take effect in us. Because what happens is, if we get a brand new idea, like a world is round idea, and we're very comfortable with a flat world, we'll entertain the idea for a while, but if it doesn't fit into our mental construct, after a while, we'll kick it out, and we'll reject it as false, and even deny it, even if the thing that we experience is so incredibly powerful as a miracle in our lives. I mean, like a bona fide healing type miracle that you could think, well, you never could deny that. The studies actually show we will. If we can't wrap our brain around what happened, and if that thing doesn't fit in our consciousness, in our brains, we literally will kick it out and eventually deny that the thing exists. And that's true for theological truths too. If, however, you can get a person, us, if we can get out on the table what it is we believe already about the world, about faith, any particular thing, let's talk about the world is flat. If we can admit that we believe the world is flat and get that out there, and then come along with your proof of why the world might not be flat, then you have a chance. So how does that play out? So I'm Flat World Pete. Right? So here I come, and I'm asked by whoever, what do you think about the world? Well, I think the world is flat. Well, why do you think the world is flat, Pete? Well, because I grew up in Kansas. Case closed. That's it. That's all you need to know. So, well, I appreciate that. The guy comes along and says, well, let's take a look at why you believe the world is flat. And so I make all my list over, this is what I believe and why I believe the world is flat. And then this guy comes over here and he starts pointing out all kinds of information that might suggest that the world is actually round. At that point, I actually have to make some decisions about which thing makes more sense. And you know what this process is doing? It's creating a new construct where the new information can actually integrate and in some cases kick out the old idea. But until we actually admit that we believe the world is flat, we'll never believe that the world is round. It's a fascinating thing. Then once we come to the conclusion, it's really not the end of the story. We need supportive community to kind of help us integrate the new ideas into our life, because we are a system unto ourselves, and our system will be like on rails the rest of our life unless we have help getting us off that track. And so what I have for you to do today, before I do the hard work of unpacking this book and some of the things that we're going to learn together, I need you to admit where you're at. And I've given you a little tool to help you do that today. So what you have in your bulletin, and if you don't have a bulletin, I have the insert for you in case you, because you're going to need that. I'm going to give you just a few minutes, like maybe 6 minutes. Here you go. Thank you. And we got a couple more here. And I just want you to fill it out front and back. It's pretty simple. Actually, can you one of you take a stack and just, so I can keep acting like I'm a pastor? All right. Very good. So you have one on the front and one on the back. One of them is just one of these deals where you rate strongly agree, strongly disagree. I think 1 is the strong agreement, 9 is strongly disagree with the statement. You just kind of put where you feel like on that. And then the other side is an attributes thing. So you put a 1 if you don't think that word describes God at all. You put a 2 if it does describe God, and you put a 3 if it really describes God. Does that make sense? So do that. I'm going to give you a few minutes, and I'm going to give you some music right now. Ted, if you can pull up the PC. Give you a couple songs to get that done, front and back. About 4 minutes. Sorry about that. about a minute and a half. All right. So there is a way to score these to get some insight, and I might publish that. These are actually two pretty well-tested assessments out of a big fat book of mine called Religious Testing something. It's an academic work. Isn't that not helpful? I didn't just make up the test is what I'm saying. It's actually a legit test, and it measures two things. The first one, where it's the strongly agree, strongly disagree, that measures where you are and your thinking about free will versus God's will. How much of it is your decisions and how much is God's? And probably there's tension in there. At least there should be some in that. And on the other side, it has to do with the attributes that you reply to God. What I'm asking you to do is to hold on to that. Just looking at your own answers, it's like you don't need the official score thing because you can just look at it and get a general idea. This is what I believe about free will or determinism, and this is what I'm basically saying is the character of God, the qualities of God. And that is your way of saying, this is what I believe. And if you have that in front of you, then you have a chance to hear something that might challenge that could possibly be helpful. So you know what? You want to know what happened to the transit center? It was a simple mistake that probably, I'm guessing, either the general contractor didn't fully understand or the construction workers themselves who were working with the steel didn't fully appreciate. It had to do on the timing of, do you weld and then cut holes, or do you cut holes and then weld? At stake were the huge girders that were holding everything up and welding on and putting into place these hangers that would then suspend the bus deck below the car deck, if that makes any sense. And the thing in question was, they knew they had to make some holes in this big hanger deal to fasten it well to the girder. And then once they had it in place, or parts of it needed to be welded, and then other things would go into these holes. And so very naturally, I mean, this would be the way I would do it. I would say, well, it doesn't really make any difference. Do what's convenient. You're going to weld first, and then the guys are cutting over here, and then you just trade, go a block away, and now you're going to weld over there, and the guys are going to cut the holes over here. Because here's a funny thing. The exact same thing, the exact same situation with a girder and a hanger was a block away from where the crack happened. But a block away, there was no sign of a crack whatsoever. And so a specialist came in from the East Coast who studies this kind of stuff. He's the guy that went to investigate the World Trade Centers collapsing and other catastrophic events. And he pretty much knew as soon as he heard there was a crack, he was going to get the call. You know what he found out through his tests? Is that when the guys decided to cut the holes before they welded the thing in place, what they didn't realize that they were doing is, with the high heat torch that they were using to cut the holes in this massive piece of steel, they were actually changing the dynamics of the steel itself. And micro fractures appeared in the steel that they could not see. And once those micro fractures were there, once they started to weld, which put strain on the metal, it was done from the beginning. If they had welded first on both sides and then cut the holes, they never would have had to repair things. But they just didn't know, because in their paradigm, they were probably thinking it really doesn't matter if you cut the holes first or weld. The steel is good. The steel's going to hold up. They didn't recognize what was happening because of how they were choosing to cut the holes. It's that kind of paradigm stuff that costs a lot of money. Costs us a lot of money. I'm not talking about taxpayers for a transit, but you and your life. That costs a lot of time. That costs a lot of emotional stuff, and you may not even realize it. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm a pastor, and part of my job as a pastor is I help people through very difficult times. Oftentimes, that very difficult thing is death. And so I've laid to rest and presided over hundreds of funeral services in my career. And they're all an honor, and I try to treat each one with great sensitivity. I pick up some phrases after so many funerals over my life, and I find out that at times of crisis and definitely death, we have our own vernacular about how to describe things, describe what we're feeling, making sense of the world. One of the things I hear all the time is, well, it was just his time. You never know when your time's going to be, but that's when God called him home. So you got a couple things happening there. You have a person saying that God called him home, and that God knew what time, ahead of time, that call was going to be made. Well, that suggests that the construct behind that is this was predetermined. Or some people say things like, I just don't know why this thing happened to me. Why am I experiencing this awful thing in my life? And the intimation of that is, God, why are you doing this to me, or why are you allowing this in my life? There must be a plan. That's the idea. Have you ever heard anybody say anything like that before? And assuming that there's a reason for everything, like there's a reason things happen. I don't know why. I don't know why I'm having this issue in my lungs. Well, it's because you've smoked all your life. Perhaps that's why, but we have this other way of thinking about things. And whether or not you realize it, that construct, while it is helpful in some ways, there's an insidious side to it that you may not be aware of, but it could very well be hurting your capacity to understand who God is, what your life's about, what it all means, how to have meaning in life, how to decide to pray or not. And depending on where you are on that free will versus determinism side, you may just flat out resign yourself to the idea that God is in control, and that means that everything that happens is exactly the way God wanted it, intended it, and we can use all kinds of fancy language about willing it or allowing it or whatever, but at the end of the day, if we have that kind of a sense of who God is and what God is doing in the world, then we really don't have any say at all, except for how well we're going to ride along with it. Now that's handy in one regard, but it makes it very difficult in another. Because if that's what it means, I knew a guy many years ago. He stopped going to church. For once, it wasn't about me. He stopped going to church because of tragedy. His grandchild was very small, like 2 years old, and somehow the gate around, or the fence around the pool was unlocked or open or whatever, and his beloved grandchild fell in the pool and drowned. And this guy, having that idea that God's control means that kind of thing is somehow allowed by God when it could have been prevented, he just couldn't come to church anymore, because he didn't want to try to know a God like that. And other people, it's that same kind of thing, but for a wide range of issues. I knew another guy, his daughter was raped, still alive. But for him, a dad thinking, if I could have been there, I would protect my daughter. Why did my Heavenly Father not protect his daughter? These kinds of questions are haunting. On mass scale, you've got the Holocaust. Ed tells me that today is the anniversary of the beginning of World War II. I have no reason to doubt you, Ed, so I'm going to go with that. So we think about World War II. We think about millions of people killed because they're Jewish. God's chosen people almost wiped out. And a lot of people look at something like that and they're like, okay, how in the world do we make sense of that? If God is that powerful, and if God is supposedly good, how do we get our heads around that? And the list goes on and on and on. It could be your personal health. It could be something that happens to work. It could be injustice, like that's the thing that's troubling you, that's pushing you over the edge. It's like you're leading your life right and you're struggling, just to get by, but that guy over there is, a big fat liar. He's making all kinds of terrible mistakes. He's hurting people. He's the Jeffrey Epstein, right? Billionaire, hurting who knows how many young girls because of his sickness, and how many other people he got involved in that, which we may never know. How is it that godly person over here is struggling so much when that guy over there is causing so much pain in people's lives, victimizing woman after woman after woman, did not, and seems to just be having the time of his life? How does that make sense? How does it make sense that you and I live in this area, this beautiful area, wine country? People come here to vacation. I mean, this is a destination. And some of you were born here in 94558, right? 94558, yeah, that's it. Some of you were born here, and you're thriving here. How come? How come some little kid over in our Faraha Community Center had to be born in the slum of Haruma, HIV positive, with his father gone, either dead or left, because he didn't want to be associated with AIDS? How do we make sense of this? Well, you probably haven't thought a lot about it, or it gets too hard to think about, and so you just throw your hands up. But it's that kind of stuff that if it remains in us, it traps us, it hurts us, it makes it very difficult for us to have any way going forward where we can marry these two things together of God is good and loving, but there's an awful lot of pain and suffering in the world that we cannot make sense. And so some of us just back up and say, well, God's ways are higher than our ways. We just can't understand it. One day we'll step back and we'll see the grand tapestry, and we'll look at the backside of it, and we'll understand how God did how it all comes together. And while I do believe that God does amazing things with horrible situations, that's one thing. It's quite another to say that God preordained that the tapestry would require millions of Jews to die, friends and loved ones dying of cancer, head-on collision by a drunk driver, another mass shooting in the United States. That's why this is important. And that's why this series is important. And I'll warn you right now that the way it works, I told you a little about how brains work and how we learn as adults. There's one thing I didn't tell you, so I'll let you know now. That there is pain and suffering in your future if you take this stuff seriously. It is quite possible, because this is the way it works in transformational thinking. It is entirely possible that there will be some concepts that we look at in your faith and what you believe, that you have based a good chunk of your life on, that we're gonna see how hard that brick is in the foundation. And we might just rip it out to examine it and see what it's like. And it's quite possible that there will be several things happening in your faith and in your personal construct that you might get to a point where you feel like you are in such a fog that you're not even sure if you believe in this whole God thing at all. I'm willing to take that risk. I hope you're willing to take that risk. I've been through it, by the way, and so I know what it's like. I know the fear that is there when you let go of the known that has kind of worked, and you start heading forward not quite knowing what the new thing is. I've used the example before. It is walking the Golden Gate Bridge in a thick fog. It's a crazy experience if you've never done it. You know the bridge is there, but you can't see anything. It shouldn't make you nervous, but you kind of are. Because what if something happened just a few moments ago and I didn't know it? And now that very next step could be the very last one. That's what this experience is like, of examining what you believe, why you believe it. How does this thing fit in with a grander biblical theology of God? How do we understand that so that our lives can integrate into this thing? It's worth it, because at the end of the day, I think you're going to be more compelled to take your life and your faith more seriously. I think you're going to want to pray more. I think you're going to want to take seriously what you can do with your life to make a real difference, because you're going to discover that you can make a massive difference. And in fact, you're going to discover that God is counting on you to join in what God is trying to do in the world to make a difference. So if you're happy where you are, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. That's great, and enjoy it. But if you're willing to take a risk, at least for a few weeks, and have the thoughtful exercise of examining where you are on this really big issue that has stumped people for a very long time, then I encourage you to go for it, and to realize that you are in a long line of ancestors in the faith who have done exactly the same thing. Starting with Abraham in the Bible, well, before that, but the historicity of it's questionable. So starting with Abraham, leaving everything for something new and different, not sure what's ahead, whole new paradigm of God. Every patriarch after that, every chapter of Israel's history is another opportunity to learn something greater about God, and they did. When Jesus came along and whatever happened to him radically transformed him, he started talking about it. You know, one of the things that he said? This sounds so tame to us because of where we are, but Jesus started his greatest sermon ever with this. These are just some of the blow-by-blows. God blesses those who are poor. God blesses those who mourn. God blesses those who are humble. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice. God blesses those who are merciful. God blesses those whose hearts are pure. God blesses those who work for peace. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right. We hear this and we're like, that is a lovely Hallmark card. But what if you're one who's been humbled by the Roman government? What if you're one who's been working your butt off and you are dirt poor and you may not eat today? What if you stood up for the right thing that you thought God wanted you to do and you're confident that it is, and you got whipped, literally whipped for it? When Jesus said this stuff and everything else in that, he was pushing people's constructs. He was saying there is a new way to think. There's a new way to believe. And I'm here to tell you what I've discovered. When the Apostle Paul tried to wipe out these Christians, these new Jewish people who are saying such terrible, blasphemous things about their Jesus, it was on his way to rounding some of them up that he got stopped by the living Christ as a blinding light and was blind for a period of time. had to totally trust as he was trying to figure out a new way. That's what we're heading for. The Apostle Peter, and I just gave you Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 10, you have Peter at lunchtime, really, really hungry, praying on a rooftop, waiting for lunch to get prepared. And he has this incredible vision where this massive sheet comes out of heaven. It's filled with all the food Jewish people cannot eat. And 3 times in a row, he hears this voice say, "Peter, take and eat." Now, Peter grew up in the synagogue. He knew the rules. He loved to eat, and he knew what he couldn't eat. And so 3 times in a row, he thinks, God is trying to test me. I've blown this 3 times in a row thing before. I'm not going to blow it today. And so he answers it correctly, and he says, "Forbid it, God. I would never eat what you have forbidden." The 3rd time, however, he stands his ground. He's like, "I'm not going to eat it." And the voice of God comes back to him and says to him in a way that he understands, "Do not call unclean what I am calling clean. Eat." Well, that crazy thing, I mean, it's hard for us to understand because we don't have those kind of restrictions, but you are breaking a massive law that everybody knew. And he was invited into a new way of thinking. That new way of thinking about food led to a new way of thinking about an entire people group that up to that point was excluded from Christianity. Basically non-Jewish people. That opened his eyes to go to a home, to tell about Jesus. The Spirit of God showed up in that way that was undeniable, and Peter did a ridiculous thing. He baptized them right then and there. He did not have permission to do that. He got hammered for it. But after a while, they had to admit, if God was already there and already doing it, who are we? But I want to tell you, the steps between the rooftop where he's waiting for lunch and getting to that place, which was a long period of time, where the Jerusalem council, who decided this was okay, finally said it was okay, was hard. And he paid a price. But he became Peter. Who are you becoming? What's at stake? You probably aren't working on anything like that. What's at stake for you? What's at stake for you if you don't push forward? I hope that the Spirit of God will do what I cannot do and encourage you forward in the journey, just to ask the questions, just to consider a new way of thinking that may actually be helpful and help you resolve one of the biggest, hardest questions we face in this human existence. How do we understand pain and suffering in the world when we believe that God is also good? That's where we're going. Let's pray together. So God, I'm asking that the thinking doesn't stop, and actually, I'm asking that your Spirit really mess with us this week, that more and more and more we can clarify what we actually believe to be true, so that we can take an honest look at it, and your Spirit can help guide us in our thinking, not toward heresy or apostasy, not away from biblical thinking or away from things that are not, or that are true, but that actually we might discover greater truth. That there are more ways to approach something that we thought was unanswerable and unsatisfactory. Give us a hunger to know. Give us a hunger to be honest. Give us courage to walk the bridge in the fog. Give us a humility to be honest about things in our life that aren't so great. To be honest enough to say we might be wrong. To be honest and humble enough to say, I really want to learn. Because our lives are at stake. Our relationship with you is in the balance. And the world needs us with you, joined by your Spirit, making a difference, not just for ourselves and our inner peace, but being agents of your love and grace in the world. Be with us as we go forward. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm pretty much going to follow the book in order. So read the introduction this week. If you want to chew on a little bit together, there are questions at the end of every chapter that we'll go through, including the introduction. If you want to come talk about it, I'll have lunch for you on Wednesdays at 12. And starting this week, I'll have dinner for you at 6:30. We'll kick that back up. The dinner will not be very good, or the lunch, but it will be there. I am a master at putting together Costco salads, and I will actually put them in a bowl instead of just bringing the bags. So it will be tasty-ish, and you can get in on the conversation where the real stuff happens. All right? You sound so excited. I'm so excited for you. All right. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next week.